All right, thanks to Adil and Sadia, who sadly couldn't be here, but I'm excited to be part of this session, kicking it off. Today I'll be talking to you about this idea that one stimulus can produce many different experiences, and I'll be focusing on within subject variability to understand neural correlates of conscious interpretations. So if anyone was at my talk yesterday, this figure might be familiar to you, but my lab has been very interested recently in this phenomenon of how the same external sensory information can cause different subjective experiences or interpretations. And we often think of this as an across-subject phenomenon, so you and I both see the same information, and you might feel one way and I might feel a different way. But this is a phenomenon that can also occur within people. So the same person exposed to the same information multiple times, if something shifts to sort of produce a shift in their contextual beliefs, for example, about that stimulus or another perspective on that stimulus, you can actually have the exact same subject and the exact same sensory information producing different interpretations. So that's what I'll focus on today, is this question of even when both the subject and the sensory information are the same, can we detect differences in neural representations that mirror these shifts in subjective experience? And all of the work that I'll present today has been led by my fabulous PhD student, Clara Sava-Siegel. So we know that these within-subject shifts in subjective experience can arise in several different types of situations. So one thing that can happen is you might experience something and then you learn some new set of facts that kind of shift your belief or your contextual framework for interpreting that information. So in other words, you learn a new sort of ground truth that changes how you're interpreting that experience. But another possible situation is, as we know, there's many ambiguous scenarios in the real world that don't necessarily have a known ground truth. So you might come to one interpretation, but then something might happen to kind of push you towards another, and it's not necessarily a factual manipulation or a ground truth shift, but it's just sort of a different perspective that might be equally valid or plausible that you can take on that information. So I'll present two studies today, each one looking at one of these possible factors that can cause these within-subject shifts in subjective experience. So starting with this idea of a new ground truth, so to speak. So for this first study, we were using an audio podcast, and this podcast was a dialogue between two characters, a male and a female character. And it kind of starts out with one interpretation, but then there's a twist about halfway through that causes you to reevaluate who the characters are and what they're doing. So before the twist, you think it's just it's taking place in a mall, in a bridal shop. There's a female sales associate who's like a little bit ditzy, and then there's a guy in there who's being a little bit obnoxious. But then this twist occurs, and sorry, I'm going to spoil it for you guys, but you learn that actually this is taking place in a post-apocalyptic zombie world, and the female character is actually a robot, and the male character is fighting for his life. So people listen to the stimulus, and they're mostly just listening, but they're also doing this character rating task where we're having them rate the female character specifically on a scale from positive to negative. So people usually start out feeling sort of positively toward her, and then once they learn she's a robot, they're not so keen on her. And so what people do is they listen to this stimulus once through in the scanner, and then after the first listen, we ask them to describe moments that they are now kind of reappraising in light of that twist that has shifted their interpretation of these different events that occurred in the first half of the story. And then they listen through again. So they have the benefit of having heard the twist, and they know that new interpretation. And so what we're hypothesizing here is that between the two listens, even though the sensory experience is exactly the same, in that pre-twist period, you're now sort of reinterpreting everything you're hearing in that first half, in the second listen, in light of that twist that's induced that shift in interpretation. So we expect there to be larger shifts in both the neural representations and the behavioral ratings in that pre-twist period compared to the post-twist period. And I should say all of this data was collected by a former postdoc in the lab, Dr. Claire Grahl, and analyzed by Clara. So here just showing some example behavioral data. So these are character ratings from 3 different subjects over time. And so you can see in listen one is in blue and listen 2 is in black. And you can kind of see visually that these ratings differ more in that pre-twist purple period. They kind of start to stabilize in that post-twist period. And we can quantify this and see that indeed your sort of subjective feelings towards that female character are more different when we compare you across listens before you get the twist versus after. So we can also look at the neural representations. So here we are taking a pattern intra-subject correlation approach. So what this means is that at every single TR, we can pull out the multivoxel pattern of activity in a given region. And so at each TR, the auditory input is exactly matched, but we're looking across listens at that same TR to see how much of a shift in the neural representation of that information we can see. And so again, we're hypothesizing that we'll see more of a neural representational shift in that pre-twist period. And so here I'll just show you the general consistency across listens. So this is, again, within the same subject, same exact sensory experience, same auditory input. I've split it out by the pre-twist and the post-twist period, and so you can see that, as expected, there's a lot of consistency within the same person as they're listening to the same thing, especially in auditory cortex and language regions. But you can kind of start to see visually here that the consistency is actually a bit higher in the post-twist period, which is what we hypothesized. So we thought that there might be more of a shift in that pre-twist period, and we can directly contrast these against each other and see that indeed we see more of a neural representational shift across much of the brain. So again, the sensory experience is exactly the same, but you are now updating your understanding of what's happening specifically in that first half of the story, and that's reflected in these neural representational shifts. We can get even more specific with this and sort of do an even stronger test of this idea. So as I mentioned before, we had subjects verbally report in between listens which moments they were specifically reappraising in light of that new information. And so here, this is kind of a raster plot style graph showing across time how many subjects are reporting specifically reappraising one of these given moments. And this is all in the pre-twist period, so most of this stuff is getting reappraised to some extent. But the moments that I'm highlighting in yellow are ones where nearly all subjects reported a sort of high degree of reappraisal. And we're comparing those to control moments still from the pre-twist period in gray, where fewer people sort of reported having a strong reinterpretation of that moment. And these are length matched and sort of close in time to those high reappraisal moments of interest. So here's just one example of what a subject said. During this stimulus, you kind of hear intermittently this song playing in the background, and at first you think it's just kind of mall background music, and then you later learn that it's actually an emergency signal going off. So that was one moment that many subjects reported reappraising. So when we do this really tightly controlled analysis, we see this one region here in particular in the angular gyrus kind of picking up specifically on these high reappraisal moments and really showing a shift above and beyond with that extra shift in sort of your understanding of what's actually happening at that moment. Okay, so that was the first study, and so again here we're kind of manipulating, you're kind of getting a new set of facts. So at first you think she's just a woman, then you learn she's a robot. It's not actually all that ambiguous. Most people sort of accept that twist as, okay, now I understand what's really happening here. But as I mentioned before, there's other possibilities in the real world, which is you don't always know what the ground truth is, and there are different, somewhat equally plausible sometimes interpretations of the same information. You don't necessarily know what's right or wrong, but nonetheless, you can kind of switch between them. For example, if you learn new information from a friend or something like that. So in the second study, that's what we're looking at. And so for this study, we really wanted to try to find kind of the analog of what we call these bistable perceptual stimuli, like this Necker cube here. We wanted to find analogs of these stimuli in the social domain. So in sort of the higher level social cognitive domain, can we find stimuli like this, where different people can look at the same image, for example, and get different possible interpretations of that image. So the stimuli that we used for this study were these somewhat ambiguous black and white photographs depicting people. And so in all of these stimuli, it's, you're not totally sure kind of what the people are, what they're doing, what their relationship is to each other. And people's task in this study was to look at one of these photographs and fill out what we call this Mad Lib style passage. So we were giving them this passage and we're asking them to fill in the blanks with what they thought was happening. So here's just one example, and you can see this is real subject interpretation. So the top person looked at this photo of boys running and thought that they were running towards rich visitors that were coming from elsewhere in the world. They're feeling excited and intrigued. The person at the bottom had a very different take, so they thought there was a bushfire and they were running because they were very scared. So same exact photo, very different interpretations. Here's just a couple of other examples. Let you guys read these to yourselves, but these have been really fun. So people come up with pretty different, just spontaneously come up with pretty different interpretations of the same images. Okay, and so what people are actually doing on this task on each trial, so we have them initially just look at the image with no real context and just try to form an impression of what's happening. Then we ask them to generate their own interpretation by speaking aloud to fill in this passage containing 3 blanks. So this person might say something like this, for example. This is a group of miners. They're on this beach because they just finished work for the day. They're feeling exhausted. Then they rate their confidence in that initial interpretation that they gave. Then after a brief delay, we present them with an alternate interpretation, and so this is sourced from another actual subject in the study. And so maybe this person said, this is a group of escapees. They are on this beach because they've just taken a long voyage. They're feeling relieved. And we can actually manipulate on the fly the semantic distance between these interpretations. So we can select an interpretation that's a given distance away from what you said to try to manipulate the distribution of that across trials. And I'll come back to that later. And so after people see this second person's interpretation, they look at the image again. And then finally, we ask them to do this reinterpretation task where they're rating the extent to which they agree with both their initial self-generated interpretation as well as the other person's interpretation. So all of that would be an experimental trial, and we're comparing that against control trials where everything's exactly the same, but people don't see that alternate interpretation. So they just see the image, give their own interpretation, and then they wait for a brief delay, see the image again, and re-rate their confidence in their interpretation. So the data I'll show you today are just some preliminary data from an ongoing data collection effort. I'll start with just some of the behavioral data. So here, what I'm showing in these plots on the x-axis is that initial confidence rating that you give right after you first generate your own interpretation. And on the y-axis is how confident you are after seeing the image for the second time. And so in the control trials, you haven't actually seen someone else's interpretation. And so we see that the confidence ratings are more stable, so they're kind of closer to that identity line. You're not changing as much across those two viewings and how confident you are in your interpretation. Whereas in the experimental trials, you can see more of a spread. So some people get more confident in their own interpretation after they see someone else's. Some people get less confident. This is on a trial-by-trial basis, too, so it doesn't have to be always the same within a person. But on any given trial, you might sort of shift more towards the other person's interpretation, or you might be stubborn and kind of stick with your own. But you can see that in the spread here, and we can quantify that, of course, and see that there is, in fact, more of an absolute difference in your ratings of your own interpretation, depending on whether you've been exposed to someone else's or not. And so the first thing we wanted to test in the fMRI data is this idea that exposure to any alternate interpretation, regardless of how much you end up endorsing that interpretation, might shift your neural representations of the stimuli. So here again, we're taking a multivoxel pattern approach, so we can pull out the pattern associated with the initial viewing stage. And then we compare that to the second viewing stage. So again, the sensory input is exactly the same. You're just looking at this photograph. But the difference is that in the experimental trial, you've seen someone else's interpretation. And so we expect there to be more of a shift on those experimental trials versus the control trials in that pattern of activity. And that is, in fact, what we find across much of the brain. And so this is independent of whether you actually switch to the interpretation or not. Just simply being exposed to any alternate interpretation can change neural representations, again, across much of the brain. We can also look at how the magnitude of these shifts relate to some of the behavioral ratings that we're getting on each trial. So for example, we can model neural shifts as a function of your initial confidence. So we might hypothesize that if you're less confident in your initial interpretation, you might be more susceptible to a neural shift. And that is, in fact, what we find. Again, across much of the brain, we're seeing an effect in that direction, such that if you were less confident initially, that alternate interpretation is potentially more likely to induce a higher shift. And then finally, we can look at how the semantic distance between your interpretation and the other person's interpretation that we show you interact with neural shifts to try to predict how much you will ultimately behaviorally reinterpret. So here we're defining this reinterpretation metric as the difference between your confidence in your own interpretation plus your endorsement of the other person's interpretation. So essentially, the higher this metric is, the more you're shifting towards that other person's interpretation. And we can try to predict how much you'll shift based on an interaction between how different that other interpretation was and how much you shifted your neural representation. And so we run this model. When we run this model, we do see a number of regions popping out where the more different the interpretation was that you saw from your own and the more neural shift that it evoked, the more you are then likely to report behaviorally shifting toward that interpretation. And just to give you a feel for this interaction here, this is what this looks like. So you can see the high semantic distance trials in dark purple are really the ones showing an effect where as you get more of a neural shift, you are then more likely to ultimately behaviorally endorse that second interpretation. Okay, time to wrap up. So in conclusion, we're seeing that within subject shifts in neural representations occur with so-called updated ground truth contextual frameworks. But they also occur when you're just considering other plausible interpretations for the same information, and they can even be used to predict upcoming reinterpretation as reported behaviorally. So if you'd like to learn more about that second study in particular, please see poster 0964, and thank you very much.
Okay, so we will take the questions at the end. So if you can use the audience response system to submit your questions, then we can ask them during the panel discussion. So the next